All right, hello friends, welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be presenting on Aquinas on the notion of creation. Starting off, not to waste any time, the claim of my presentation is that right here, my thesis statement, St. Thomas's account of creation involves a synthesis of Aristotle's metaphysical doctrine of hylomorphic substance and a semblance, that's a key word there, semblance of Plato's notion of participation. However, only insofar as it refers to the relationship of material thing to esse. So, throughout this presentation, as this thesis is claiming, it is my understanding that reading through the corpus of Thomas Aquinas, as regards creation, this notion develops out of both Aristotle's, right? Aristotle's claims, his metaphysical claims, the doctrine of hylomorphic substance, of matter and form, right? Existing things exist because the form inheres in the matter and actualizes it, but also that there must be something to account for, the actualizing potential, if we'll call it, of the form itself. There must be something that gives the form its actuality, that enables it to inhere and actualize matter. So, there's both of these figures, at least in my understanding, that contribute to St. Thomas's notion of creation. So that's the claim, and we'll kind of break this down. It's kind of meaty, but that's the point of this morning. So leading off, I thought it would be most helpful if we start with early Aquinas, so his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences. Here, St. Thomas says, everything imperfectly realized within a given genus derives from that in which the nature of the genus is primarily imperfectly, as heat is produced in things by fire. In other words, this relationship, at least in early Aquinas, of an imperfect being participating in a perfect first principle kind of sets the tone for his entire evaluation going forward of creation. He says again in the same distinction in Peter Lombard's sentences, everything and all that is present within a thing participates in esse in some way and is mixed with imperfection. It follows that every single thing, in terms of all that is present in that thing, arises from the first imperfect being. In other words, there is like a relationship of imperfect, participation in esse, to that perfect, full expression of the act of being. So again, maybe terms are important here. Esse, as we read in this class, is the act of being, and it is imperfectly realized in an existing thing, insofar as that existing thing has a material component, right? If we have matter, we have potency, and therefore we can't fully exist, as it were. However, we do exist by our form, which receives esse imperfectly, albeit from a perfect being. So this is kind of like this first leading off notion of creation. Again, kind of just highlighting what creation is for early Aquinas. Here's the sentence, a definition that I kind of drew up. Production of a thing in esse according to its entire substance, proceeding from its first principle. And so, two important aspects of creation is that it's distinct from change. It's not presupposing the existence of anything prior. Creation, rather, has a very narrow definition for Aquinas, at least early Aquinas in this first evaluation, in that creation is the entire causation of a thing, where it's brought from pure potency to act. And the second aspect, following from the first, is that creation refers to bringing a thing from non-esse to esse, from nothing, And creation is not, the imparting of existence in some kind of point in history, but rather it refers to an ongoing influence of esse, It's almost as if God is not deistic, who knew? But here, creation for Aquinas, clearly early Aquinas too, is that what creates holds a thing in existence. it holds it in the act of being. It holds it in esse. And I think I like this quote here, an abiding influence, right? It's likened to that, as compared to maybe a God that creates an point in history, which is not true. Creation is an ongoing relation. And we'll get to that notion of relation, of esse to an imperfect participating subject in the world in later Aquinas. So maybe a question to kind of lead off here is that what kind of participation does Aquinas develop in his doctrine of creation? Because of course we know it can't be strictly Platonic. He famously subscribes to Aristotle's criticism of Plato's theory of participation, Metaphys, right? In other words, Aquinas, with Aristotle, rejects the existence of separate self-subsisting forms. Right? For Plato, right, his metaphysical kind of like framework, at least as it's classically understood, is that the existence of material objects is based on an extrinsic principle, on a kind of separated influence that he calls forms. These are universals, right? These are immutable concepts. And they kind of like float around, right? I guess float is a weird way to describe them, but the point is they don't inhere in matter. They're separated from matter, right? A thing participates, a material thing participates in a form, not insofar as the principle of its being, but insofar as it's kind of an ideal, right? And material things in that respect, right, are mere shadows. I mean, we see this in the analogy of the cave. Material things are shadows. They're illusions. They're not real. They're only real insofar as they partake in a semblance of a form, right? In a semblance of that light for which the puppet show is being acted out on the wall, right? But what we see in our day-to-day lives, right, is are things that shouldn't be trusted for Plato, right? He's very dualistic. He presents a very negative view of the world, of the material world, as compared, as we'll see, to Aristotle. So, of course, Aquinas does not believe that this is the case, that this is what's going on. The good life for Plato, maybe a good contrasting point, the good life for Plato is to rise to the contemplation of the forms, is to go beyond matter. This is why in the Apology we see Socrates so willing to give up his flesh, to be liberated from his chains, right? His slavish desires and passions, right? So everything associated with the body, anything associated with the world is less real, is less good. If we can even call it real or good, right? It's merely a semblance, merely a shadow or an illusion of that true good, of that true light that exists beyond the cave. So we got to escape from the cave, right? Analogically, we got to escape from the cave. We got to escape from the material world and contemplate the forms in their essence. So we got to shed the body, right? That's the good life for Plato. Now, Aristotle retorts against this in the Metaphysics, and he doesn't believe that reality is dependent on independently existing forms or abstracts. Rather, reality, for Aristotle, is particular substances of physical things, right? And substance has a very particular meaning here. Substance, for Aristotle, is an individual particular, right? It's a thing in the world. That's what actually exists. Substance refers to a real, self-subsisting thing, an entity, that cannot be predicated of anything else, right? But is predicated of. It exists, right? And precisely a substance exists insofar as a form, an actualizing cause, inheres in matter and disposes it to be in a certain way, right? So life as we know it, life for living things, but also non-living things, right? They all exist. They all have material and formal causes. They have an active principle, a nature, in other words, that disposes the matter to be in a certain way. Even a rock does. I mean, Aristotle will go as far as to say that a rock, due to its nature, inclines toward the center of Earth. Right? That's a That's an insane claim. Probably a metaphysical claim that wouldn't be made today. Nonetheless, a dynamic view of the world, right? The whole world is kind of like it's ordered by its internal principle. But the big takeaway here again is that there are major departures in Aristotle from his teacher in Plato. For Plato, a thing's substance is due entirely to its form. A form exists independently, right? Material things merely participate in little degrees, in illusory degrees. Whereas for Aristotle, individual particulars actually exist, right? So he has a very positive view of the material world. So Aquinas adopts Aristotle's idea of substance, that forms exist in particular things and not as separate existing Platonic entities, right? Universal concepts for Aquinas are ultimately rooted in the real, concrete particulars of the world, right? Very Aristotelian. Forms exist in re, or in individuated things, right? Big takeaway here, reality is the inherence of forms in matter. Created things are composites of form and matter, a substance, a hylomorphic compound, right? So big departures here from Plato, big rejection of the theory of forms. And with that rejection of the theory of forms, a rejection of this notion of participation as being an illusory thing, right? Participating in minimal degrees in the real thing, right? A departure from the Platonic idea that material things don't actually exist, right? For Aquinas, material things very much exist. Particular things very much exist. He goes on to say, in being in essence, he sides very explicitly with Aristotle here, right? Matter and form exist in their own right per se, right? Existence is not equivalent to form, in other words. Big also kind of thing here on being in essence, chapter 2, he equates essence, with the term essence, with substance, and that'll come up later. We want to draw attention to that right now, but the essence of a thing for Aquinas is both its matter and form. It's both the active principle inhering in the matter. That's the essence of a thing. It's not just the form. Right? There we go. So again, the big takeaway for St. Thomas is that substance is a particular individual in a concrete world. It's not an independently existing form, as Plato would hold. So there are major differences here. So again, Aquinas is not adopting a notion of participation that follows immediately and almost haphazardly from Plato. He has a deeper metaphysical current in him, in Aristotle. And then the question then is, given that universals do not exist in themselves, how do we make sense of Aquinas' idea of participation? Now the reconciliation, so here we go. So in the De Hebdomadibus, the commentary on Boethius' on the Hebdomads, we find in lecture 2 a kind of reconciliation, or attempted, start. This is midlife Aquinas, right? Not fully matured yet. We'll get there, but in this midlife Aquinas, he's attempting his first reconciliation of a kind of participation, right, with the hylomorphic view of substance. He says here in lecture 2 that things exist either per essentium or per participationem. So again, as we just reviewed, per essentium refers to hylomorphic compound of a form and matter inhering in a substance. Of course, we've reviewed that. That is something he's taken almost verbatim from Aristotle. But now he wants to say that a thing can actually exist per participationem, by participation. And he says this in the sense that in the way an effect participates in a cause. He says, and this is the sense operative when we say the creature participates in its creator, the finite being and being itself. So you see here, right, participation is really referring to a creation, right, a relationship of creature to creator. But in what way? Right, we still have this question. In what way? So again, to exist, participation is for an effect to participate in its cause, right? And he relates that to creation. And this is kind of right. Right in question 50. He again kind of distinguishes himself from Plato here. He doesn't want to adopt a full right, Platonic theory of participation. In his treatise on angelic nature, he claims that he distinguishes form from esse, and in his view of the angels, he says that they exist as pure forms and not composites. And so it kind of would make sense though, right? If they're pure form, they're pure act. But he doesn't say that. He says that angels exist, do not exist as pure actuality, and rather says that though angels are pure forms without matter, they're not absolutely simple. They're not pure act, but have a mixture of potentiality and composition of form and being. So, in other words, the big takeaway here is that, at least what I found in this dialogue in the angels, is that it's possible for a thing to be a pure form without having pure existence. Right, so again, not Platonic. Right, he doesn't want to. It's not the same kind of participation as Plato would hold. Yeah, so substances again are not essence, not existence or esse in themselves. Everything that receives, he says, something from another is in potency with respect to what it receives, and that which is received in the thing is its act. Therefore, a quiddity or form that is an intelligence is in potency with respect to the existence that it receives from God, and this received existence is received as its act. Right, so again, right here, forms play a constituent part in a thing's substantial existence, right? They actualize. But he wants to say too, right, and this is a great distinction, they do not confer being to that substance. In other words, they might actualize, forms might actualize, but they aren't actuality. That's esse. And so here we were beginning to see this, the coherence of both Plato and Aristotle in Aquinas' notion of creation and metaphysics in general. We're beginning to see that Aquinas in a real sense adopts this idea from Plato that there must be something prior, right, to particularly existing things. There must be something that gives the form its actuality. And that is exactly esse. It's participation. It's the participation of the form which actualizes the matter, right, as a substance in esse, in other words. Yeah, so this is exactly creation for Aquinas. While forms exist and are dependent upon matter, right, hylomorphism, it ultimately is the case that the forms are given their existence first by God, who is esse, right? And in turn, those forms, we want to say, dispose the matter to be in a certain way, right? So while the form is the act of the compound disposing the matter to be a certain way, the form is not ontologically prior to any existing thing, as Plato might have said, but rather esse is, right? Esse, it exactly, esse imparts existence to the creature, beginning it into existence from nothing to something, from non-esse to esse. Right, so this relationship, a very good summative sentence here, this relationship of esse to the substance is creation, and this is the type of participation endorsed by St. Thomas. So finally, the final part of our presentation today is the mature Aquinas. And I'm calling him mature here because we find him going full throttle in question 45, article 3, in regards to his theory of participation. He says here, creation is a type of relation of the created substance to its creator. who's the principle of its essay. He writes, in the creature, the act of creation is nothing other than a certain relation of the creator as the principle of its essay. Right, so again, as we mentioned in the outset, in early Aquinas, right, in his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, this relationship, right, of the created thing, this imperfect participating thing in the perfect creator's essay, is an enduring act, not one at a moment in history, a linear time, but a dependence on the substance on an external principle, right? An ongoing relationship to existence itself. So in a real way, Aquinas is really holding here to, John 1. The idea that we're really being held in existence, that our forms are being given act, and our forms in a real way dependent on essay, this relationship to essay. And, this is kind of a cool part too in question 45. Aquinas notes that different substances participate in an essay in different degrees. Sorry, there's a mistake there in the text. They participate in essay in different degrees. Right, while all of creation expresses an existence in accord with its nature, the human or rational nature bears the closest resemblance to God in its free will. Right, so he interprets his exegesis here, right? I know it's a metaphysics class, but Aquinas, there's no distinction for him in terms of philosophy and theology. So he does a really good job of doing some exegesis here. And he says, right, we're made in the image and likeness of God insofar as we're set apart to be like God, right? And he actually turns this too, and he says, well, this is not, right, an anthropomorphic, claim, of domination over creation, but rather we are to be stewards of lower participating substances, right? We're to organize them and help them imagine God more fully, or reorganize the inanimate substances of the world to imbue kind of a deific quality, right? We see that maybe in architecture. Pretty cool stuff. So anyways, I hope to hear your questions in class. Participation is kind of a heady subject, as is hylomorphic compound. But I really do think that the creation for Aquinas follows from this thesis that I've claimed today, that it's both a synthesis or a marriage, if you will, of both a semblance of Plato's theory of participation, insofar as a imperfect particular thing participates in a real, an actual thing, and that a thing exists in its particular instantiation, right? Because we don't want to fall into a deistic trap here. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope to hear questions in class. Thank you.